that we're launching our second book in 12 months about Jamaican culture and the Caribbean. And the second one, with which H. Patten is involved. We were joking in the office earlier that January is H. Patten month at the ISRM. So we've already reserved January at 25 for the book that you're undoubtedly writing this year, so we can watch it again in 12 months. So welcome back.
Thank you.
As you know, Jamaica is a small Caribbean island with a total population that's about a third the size of London's population. And yet it is a global cultural powerhouse in music and dance, also literature and art. So given Jamaica's size, how is this even possible? H's last book offered a big part of the answer for reggae dancehall dance. So to butcher your book, H, into a single sentence. My apologies for this. Answer is partly that dancehall brings spiritual energies into embodied material forms that activate liberatory agency and emancipatory capabilities. There's the days and nights of dancing in which we come to know that anything is possible, including communal agency, including revolutions in consciousness that can, over time, revolutionize material conditions. So even untrained, terrible dancers like me have some inkling of the tale of dance power that H told in that book. This book ties dancehall explicitly to the interactions of security and insecurity that suffuse everyday life in the communities that create the music and the dance. So the creativity of these communities is just tremendous. I mean, even watching a few videos takes your breath away with the force of the invention, the discipline, and the skill. And the videos, of course, are just an echo of the actual immersive experience. The insecurity of these communities is also tremendous. Many are what have come to be called garrison communities, defined in the 1980s by Carl Stone and others as, quote, militarized strongholds based on political traditions, cultural values, beliefs, myths, and socialization that were then maintained through a framework of violence and patron-client relations, unquote. Dancehall and other cultural forms emerged in an era of state disinvestment from communities in many countries, and Jamaica was not an exception to the governmental austerity imposed on the least well-off by the Washington Consensus. Dancehall is what our authors call a diverse site of negotiation between security and insecurity in the everyday lives of communities and expressive of what they term negotiative agency between security and insecurity. So dancehall arises in communities that are subject to the circuits of racial capitalism on a planetary scale, including circuits of one of imperialism's favorite commodities, drugs, going back at least to Britain's opium wars on China. Dancehall emerges from the insecurity induced by neoliberal political economy, and yet is a celebratory force using what Noxolo calls corporeal negotiation as part of what she also calls a communally organized structure of feeling that is simultaneously an arena for thinking. My own impression reading the book was of multiple opportunities through dancehall of experiencing oneself as having affective and bodily and intellectual power in the midst of the living legacies of slavery and colonization that would deny that power. The authors do not idealize or romanticize dancehall, but instead work through the details of combined social and aesthetic practices to show how dancehall, in L'Antoinette Steins's terms, provides an opportunity for participants to construct a terrain on which they can reconceive the world as secure for them. It's a tribute to the scholarship that this book makes this art-based security feel real. Okay, just a short comment now about the Independent Social Research Foundation that is sponsoring this event. Nicely cited here in ancient Gresham College and Barnes Inn Hall. The ISR was founded, in contrast to Gresham, about 15 years ago by dissident political economists. And I'm sorry they aren't here to see the interlinking of political economy with culture, music, and dance that this book enacts. This research exemplifies what they hoped might emerge from this foundation. I mentioned at H's last launch that many ISRF fellows study individual and collective agency that persists against impossible odds. And this book's vision of dance agency is a central instance. Many ISRF fellows work on making social rights prior to economic rights. And I was prompted by reading Dancehall In Securities to think also about cultural rights and rights of agency through cultural production. Many ISRF fellows re-theorize equality. This book overlaps with Oche Onazi's rework of Ubuntu to structure egalitarian social relations that might better support the rights of the disabled. A growing number of ISRF fellows work on anti-racism. Dancehall In Securities overlaps with the discussion in our July launch of Arun Kundnani's book, What is Anti-Racism and Why It Means Anti-Capitalism. Arun and his discussant, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, will be very interested in this book's ideas about cultural agency pushing against the racialized geoeconomics that is their main concern. Many ISRF fellows work on imperialism and colonialism. Next month, on February 15th, we will launch Laura Montesinos Coleman's book, Struggles for the Human, about overcoming the limits of liberal models of decolonization in Latin America. Those details for this are on the ISRF website if you're interested. Also in February, we begin our lecture series on migration in partnership with Gresham, again with Dr. Nishat Awad speaking on the visual politics of refugeehood. In May, Lars will launch the historian Martin White's book on colonial legacies. I say all this partly just to plug our great fellows and our events, but I also say to express my conviction, which is deepened by reading this book, that these convergences are sources of transformative power, if not today, then tomorrow. Okay, so we're very lucky to have two of the authors, editors of this book, as well as our respondent, Kate Dossett. So we'll hear from the authors for, I don't know, half an hour, 40 minutes, so relaxed, kind of informal time framing. And then we'll hear from Kate in response, and we'll then open up the conversation to all of you. So I will just you're not speaking together, you're going to do sequential. All right, so I'll start with you, Pat, and then I'll just introduce each of them as they speak. Pat Noxolo is professor at the University of Birmingham, where she has taught since 2014. Her work brings together the study of international development, culture, and insecurity, and uses post-colonial discursive and literary approaches to explore the spatialities of a range of Caribbean and British cultural practices. She has been lead researcher on the Caribbean Insecurities and Creativity Research Network, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and on the project Creative Approaches to Race and Insecurity, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. She's also a Brummie. Did I say that right? Because I just learned that word today. I apologize for my ignorance. Meaning, I say this for myself and not for you. Born and brought up in Birmingham. Since receiving her PhD from Nottingham Trent University in 2000, Dr. Noxolo, Professor Noxolo, has also held research posts at Leicester University and lectureships at Coventry and Sheffield University. She took up her, I already said that. All right, over to you, Pat.
Today I want to just think about, give you a little bit of an introduction to this volume that Kate and I and Sonjah Stanley-NIaah, who many of you will know her work, she's one of the foremost dancehall scholars based at the Centre for Global Reggae Studies at University of the West Indies. So Sonjah, everybody else who collaborated in this book with us is based in Jamaica, one also in Denmark. So that's why it's just Kate and I today. But this was very much something that we're very proud of, because the collection of people in here, some of them are practitioners, some of them are academics, some of them they're across different disciplines. Not all of these people are people who normally write, but many of them are. And so we got some of the foremost scholars, Professor Carolyn Cooper, Sonjah Stanley-NIaah, various other people, Dennis Howard, who other people will have heard of. But we also were able to have people like Patten, who is really very under-celebrated in terms of their contribution to Jamaican dance. All of this took work, many of HU's contacts, so all of this was very kind of personal. So we're really, really proud of this volume. I think it's a kind of singular volume in very many ways. So I'll tell you a little bit about how it came about as a volume. These are the contributors here. So say the me and H, Sonjah Stanley-NIaah, Carolyn Cooper, who, if any of you have not read her work, it's about time you read her work. It's amazing work. She was one of the first people, the first Jamaican scholars to take seriously popular culture and to talk about it as an area of genius and wisdom. So she's a very important scholar. She's supposed to be retired, but she's still very, very active. Orville Expressions Hall is a practitioner. Dennis Howard is a musicologist. Monica Lawrence, cultural theorist, I guess. Thomas Canova Presto has been doing a lot of work in lots of different areas of black dance. Lantoinette Steins is an absolute powerhouse, has been doing really great work in terms of dance and runs her own dance company. So they're a very mixed group of people, but really interesting group of people, and we're really happy to have them. So where this came out of, this book came out of a project called Kariski, which is basically Caribbean Insecurities and Creativity. It was a Leverhulme-funded international network that I applied for and got with these 7 scholars. Kevon Riney, who's based in the US, but from Jamaica, a geographer. Ron Cummings is a literary scholar. If any of you don't know his work, again, really worth having a look. Susan Maines is based at Dundee University, she's a teacher at University of West Indies. Rivka Jaffa does a lot of work on security, Jamaican security, which is based at University of Amsterdam. It's quite unusual because actually a lot of the roots of the roots ROUTES of scholarship on the Caribbean often follow the colonial roots because of the language connections. So Rivka's fairly interesting from that point of view, with a really interesting partnership with Wayne Modeste. If any of you know, he's a Jamaican curator who's doing really interesting work in Amsterdam. Dave Featherstone does work on the political geographies, so a lot about and he's also a historical geographer, and Annie Mado, we were just talking about her today, who's a historian, does work also on security, a lot of work on kind of mobilities of various kinds, and our network facilitator. So that lasted from January 2016 to December 2018. So we were privileged to have a 3-year project. During that time, we were able to do a lot of different things, trying to work particularly with postgraduate researchers, running workshops in a number of different places, including in Jamaica. We ran a website and a lot of public presentations. There's an edited collection in small acts that came out in 2018, which sets out our theorization of security and insecurity. That might be worth a look, as well as obviously the book came out of it. So I want to just tell you a little bit of the background of this idea of in/security, because you'll notice on the front of the book it says Dancehall In/Securities. So my career has been a bit of a winding one, and at a certain point I was in political science as a research assistant, and at that point I was interested in critical security studies. So this was around the time 2005, 2007, and we were talking a lot about security in relation to terrorism. And there was a lot of kind of racist talk at that time about migrants and their relationship with terrorism. So I was kind of interested in critiquing that discourse. But we were noticing that the 21st century was very clearly a security century. So we were talking a lot about terrorism at the beginning of the century and security in that sense. But then it began to widen out into lots of different areas of security. So now we talk about human security, environmental security, livelihood insecurity, all sorts of different types of security and insecurity. Moving from the political and military, the idea that we might have security experts, towards a kind of everyday view of security, that we're all involved in security and insecurities of various kinds. So we're moving from these kinds of discrete security events, 9/11 being the kind of archetypal one, the big event, towards chronic everyday insecurities that people deal with. So it means that the meanings of security and insecurity, very good this the meanings of security and insecurity, we began to argue that those meanings are negotiated against each other. So none of us ever get to a point where we're completely secure. And this is important because we don't want security forces to be telling us how to become entirely secure. None of us get to a point where we're completely secure, particularly in these very diffuse ways. But also, that feeling of being entirely insecure is something that people are constantly negotiating against. So there's that security and there's insecurity. And I would argue that sometimes there is security in insecurity. You know, you kind of need security forces to get off your back so that you can get on with your living and living your life, you know. And for those of us in the UK, we're reading about policing and various other things, we know that security isn't necessarily where you are, or the thing that the destination. So security and insecurity are things that are negotiated constantly, and that's why we came to this idea of in/security. Insecurity and security constantly related to each other. We can't actually really understand what security is unless we understand insecurity. We can't understand insecurity without understanding security, so they're relational terms. And that gets us beyond security professionals who were really at the beginning of the 21st century taking over the world in terms of the power that they had to be able to say this is a security issue, therefore it needs to be locked down and it needs to get into it, etc. So moving beyond the security professional to the role that community and households and NGOs and artists, all sorts of people have in maintaining that balance between security and insecurity. And moving beyond the kind of exceptional spaces. This isn't about necessarily conflicts, although obviously conflicts are really important areas of insecurity. But it's about the everyday. It's about our embodied interactions. So particularly when we began to look at the Caribbean, we started to say, well, actually, if you look at the Caribbean in terms of its insular security, so if we move our gaze from the US, which at the beginning of the 21st century is very much centered in security around its own geopolitical needs, if we move that gaze and recenter it around the Caribbean, it looks very different. Firstly, it looks different in terms of geopolitics, because the Caribbean is connected with absolutely everywhere. Obviously, it's between North America and South America, and there are some very particular security issues that go on in that nexus. It has lots of post-colonial connections with Europe, and so it's very much a crossroads, as has been said very many times. It has diasporic connections with Africa, obviously, but also with Asia. So it's a really interesting kind of network of security issues. And then it has these newer relationships with the rising powers, if you like, with China, with India, who are investing a lot in the Caribbean. So it's a really interesting place geopolitically, right at the centre of everything. Environmentally, of course, the Caribbean is right at the forefront of all sorts of issues that are happening. And in terms of the climatic, of course, the Caribbean is at the forefront of change. So the hurricane seasons are getting longer and longer. There's lots of problems with flooding, sea level rise, all of these things that small island states are having to deal with. But the Caribbean is right at the forefront of a lot of those. And then, of course, the Caribbean also has a lot of very important environmental resources, coral reefs and various other things, which are also under pressure. So in terms of those kinds of environmental securities, insecurities, the Caribbean teaches us a lot. And then in terms of livelihoods, this is what is central to people's minds on a day-to-day basis. For very many people in the region, they're constantly mobile to be able to creatively find ways to make a living. There are lots of social and political pressures, and of course they're in the backyard of the US. So we're constantly finding that they're caught up in wars on drugs, wars on terror, all these sorts of things. So the Caribbean is a really interesting place to relocate security into and start to think about. So Caribbean focus tends to make us think about insular security in slightly more creative ways. I found as I was kind of growing up that the Caribbean, whenever I said that my parents were from Jamaica, people would say to me, it would either be a discourse around violence or it would be a discourse around creativity. And I've always wondered kind of what's the connection between those two things, you know, because although it's very reductive, I can certainly see why they would bring those two things up. So what's going on there? We can see that the region is really fascinating in terms of understanding modernity in a different way, because the Caribbean got the sharp end of modernity. We begin with enslavement, and as Toni Morrison says, enslavement breaks the world. So we begin with the breakage of the world, and that's the perspective that the Caribbean has. So it's a kind of a resistant perspective right from the beginning. And there's an immovability to that history of enslavement. Right? It's right at the heart, and it will stay at the heart. So it's a huge insecurity, which is a secure moment in history from which you have your perspective. There's a range of global flows that cross the region, so the region has an experience of the rest of the world that is about movement across the region, constantly feeling not just the tail end of things, but right in the middle of things. And then lots and lots of different kinds of actors, lots of negotiators between security and insecurity. Migrants, of course, not only out of the region, but into the region as well. All sorts of diaspora in different parts of the world. Tourists coming in, of course, massively coming in, but also coming in lots of different ways. And then seafarers of various kinds who've always been travelling across the region. So there's a lot of really interesting perspectives in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean brings to security a very distinctive set of perspectives. And we found that by the time we got to the end of the network, we were really thinking about all sorts of different kinds of agency. We're particularly interested in this kind of negotiative agency, that people on a day-to-day level find different ways to negotiate between security and insecurity. So there are similar terms like precarity, vulnerability, those kinds of terms. But I don't like those terms because they're relatively passive. When you say that somebody's precarious or having a precarious lifestyle or whatever, it looks as if people are just there waiting to be rescued from their precarity. So it makes sense for NGOs to define people in that way. You know, well, if you're a hammer, you define everything as a nail, right? I'm far behind where I should be. But if you're somebody who, if you want to understand that people have agency, that people work on their own behalf, you need a term that's a little bit more active than precarity or vulnerability. And that's why we've been thinking about insular security. Because really, the way I describe it to my students is that kind of, really that slash is a very active slash. There's constant activity going on around that slash. And that's from the sorts of creative practice. This can be very simple things. Sometimes it's people who have been trained dancers, such as H and many of the people that we worked with in relation to the book. It can be that kind of creative practice. But it can also be, and I very often think about this, the black guy who just walks down the street singing. He walks down the street singing full volume. And it doesn't matter what area I've lived in, that's always been the case. There's always been somebody that does this. And there's a kind of everyday negotiation that's going on there. Because obviously there's a lot of pressure to be quiet and silent and, you know, to negotiate your security through hiding yourself. But then there's also that kind of agency that's about, actually, I'm here, I need to keep myself happy, I need to look after myself, I need to express myself, this is how I need to feel, that's how I feel when I'm singing, and so I need to sing. And nobody can actually stop you from singing, it's not illegal to sing. Right? So you do this, right? You take the forms of agency that you need, and it seems to me very important. In some ways, that's the connection that I've made between the violence and the creativity. People use creativity in order to negotiate the insecurities that they're having to deal with. That's violence. It's also the kinds of large-scale or structural violences that they're having to deal with, the neglect in their neighbourhoods and everything else. People negotiate that through drawing on walls, you know, or through all sorts of creative practice. Obviously, also people negotiate one form of security against another. So people have often wondered why, for example, you have these garrison communities where people will, they seem to be able to accept the governance of violent people. But if you're weighing that against your livelihood, this is somebody who will protect you, who will give you money, then you have to weigh and balance. That's how people live their lives. And this is an active thing, it's a perfectly rational thing. And of course, we do this in different spaces, in different ways. And so in the dancehall space, there's a certain kinds of negotiation that happen. It's a negotiation that happens through the music, and obviously those who control the music are taking certain types of action. But it's also, in my chapter in the book, I argue that it's about the body as well. Julian Henriquez does a very nice kind of analysis of the bashment yalla, the rhythmatician. She's bouncing out the beat in her own way. And I think that there's something really interesting about that kind of corporeal negotiation in the everyday. That it moves us very far. I mean, Page's work does a lot of work around the dancehall space as a spiritual space. But the dancehall space is a lot more than that sort of slapless space where people are seen to be there doing irrational things. I think it's about people thinking with their bodies, with and through their bodies. And so there's a lot of ways, if you want to think about where, revolutionary change is fomented. You don't necessarily go to these cafes where people are having discussions. To go to the dancehall space, because people are doing this with their bodies, not just with their in conversation.
In case anybody in this room doesn't already know this, Patten is an associate lecturer in African Caribbean dance on the Erie Dance Theater BA Honors Degree course, and also teaches at Goldsmiths College. He received his PhD from Canterbury Christ Church University, an experienced choreographer, filmmaker, visual artist, storyteller, and performer. Page has choreographed for the Ghanaian, Nigerian, Sierra Leonean, Malawian, and Zambian national dance companies, the Stella Maris Dance Ensemble in Jamaica, and many other high-profile and distinguished productions. He has been awarded the Jamaican High Commission's 50th Anniversary Award for services in the field of arts, culture, and entertainment. His commitment to academic research, arts, culture, and education led him to found the Coratech Dance Fest Professional Development Training Program, delivering popular dynamic creative training and research in West Africa and the Caribbean since 2007. H has more recently worked on international research projects, including the Open University's Decolonizing Peace Education Project, which really just scratches the tip of the iceberg of what we've been up to. So, thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. When I say open your mouth, just answer Tory jump out. Open your mouth.
Tory jump out.
Open your mouth.
Tory jump out.
Said open your mouth.
Tory jump out.
And I better explain because I used that once before. And then somebody said, oh, I didn't know you were so political. Because they thought Tory meant, the conservative. But a story jumps out when you open your mouth. And then, really and truly, that's what I'm trying to portray today when I talk about the book. I'm so glad that Pat is here, and she went first. It's always a kind of dilemma for me because Pat is actually my sister. And then she's actually my younger sister, but she got all the brains. And so to follow her is always a difficult thing because she's so relaxed and calm, whereas you might see mine is a little bit more frantic in my delivery. But anyway, I'll try. So Pat actually lays the ground relating to in/security. And what I'm going to do today, I'm actually going to look at I'm going to look at my chapter in relation to the other chapters within the book. as Pat has explained, the chapter came about, the book came about as a result of a symposium that was held in Jamaica, because when she started on the Kariski project, then we would talk about, this whole idea of in/security, what it meant, etc. And then I came up to her one day and I said, have you thought about insecurity in relation to dancehall, insecurity in relation to the arts? Because it's quite obvious, the insecurity in relation to tourism, in relation to maritime, etc. And she had the perception to take that on board and say, okay, let's have a look at it. And when we went to Jamaica and we did the symposium there, we brought together many of the top scholars involved in Jamaican dancehall. So, apart from those that are in the book, there were people like Donna Hope, who was part of it, and then you had other scholars such as Maria Smith, who has written on Jamaican revivalism, and so there are many other voices that are not in the book, but their spirit and their energy is surrounding the book as well. Okay? So when it came to the pulling together of the book, as you can imagine, it was a real feat to get it done, because you had so many dynamic individuals who are always working, always touring, for those who are artists, because it was important not to just have academic voices, but to also have the artistic voices, so that it wasn't people speaking on behalf of the artists, but the artists also speaking on behalf of themselves. So, in my chapter, I see myself as being positioned quite differently to the rest of them, because one, I'm an artist myself, I'm a dancer, choreographer, storyteller, but then also I'm a Jamaican, but I was born 20 days after my mother came over here, which I never forgave her for that. She always said she should have had me there. But being born here and growing up within the diaspora and knowing how the culture enabled me to negotiate and maneuver my way through, because it's funny, it's going to be my birthday in a couple of days, and I can't believe it, I'm going to be 62, and I never thought that I'd actually get to the age of 21, because for a lot of my friends around me and things, there was always this struggle, especially for young black men. The struggle for survival meant that there's a lot of casualties. And so I never saw myself, I never planned anything beyond 21. And so to be getting almost 3 times the length of time is a lot of borrowed time for me. So when I started to think about all the different chapters and who was writing what, we were so lucky to have such a diversity of chapters and a diversity of approaches. So the central question that I decided to look at was, how is insecurity embedded within reggae dancehall culture? And the bodies, the dancing bodies that are articulated within that space. How does insecurity affect them? How does it reflect back? So in order to do that, I looked at 3 key things. One, I looked at dancehall culture and the representation of the birth to death life cycle. Because that essentially, that's what happens within the dancehall space. Every dancehall session goes through all of these, the major events that happens within life. And that cycle will happen a number of times through the night until it gets to the crescendo and it finishes. But when people leave, they leave renewed and they leave with a determination to continue and get to the next one. Then there's an insecure manifestation of the genealogical continuities of the African Jamaican religious and spiritual philosophies. Now I say African Jamaican because I actually use the term the African and the Neo-African, meaning New African, when I'm speaking about the Jamaican practices. And I'll elaborate on that momentarily. But really, the word traditional, particularly within the UK space, becomes a word that is seen almost as a dirty word. It represents an archive that has no meaning or relevance to the contemporary world. And so that's why I use African and Neo-African. And I speak about the African and the African Caribbean, so that we know that we're speaking about the African root, we're speaking about the Caribbean as part of the diaspora, but we're speaking about the two merging together. And within the UK space, they come together in a way that it can't happen in Jamaica, being so far from the continent. Then I spoke about the spotlight. The spotlight, and within dancehall, a lot of people speak about the video light because that's the physical manifestation. You see the light over here and everybody starts to dance. Then the light moves over there and everybody starts to dance over there. But I speak about the spotlight because the movement of the light is one thing. But there's always a spotlight, whether the light is there or not. Because when people come together and they start to dance, wherever the dance takes off, that becomes the spotlight. That becomes the place that everybody looks to. And for that moment, the individual who is dancing, the individual who is articulating and expressing themselves, they become somebody. Charles Mills talks about it as the moment of somatification, where you become somebody of worth, despite the invisibility that you normally endure in your everyday life. When you're unseen, you're unheard, you have no relevance. But within the dancehall, in the dancehall spotlight, you become somebody of worth. Okay? In Jamaica, that is very important because the first thing somebody is going to tell you when you start to talk to them in a way that they feel you're not hearing them, they say, me as somebody too. I am somebody. And this is something that happens not only in dancehall, within all of our art expression. Whether it's soca, when you go to the carnival and you see them whining and dancing and carrying on, they become somebody. It's an ordinary person who then becomes the king or the queen. And so somebody who is normally invisibilized becomes the one that everybody sees. Okay? So those are the three things. Then within my chapter itself, I looked first at the dance and the corporeal dancing body. So the corporeal dancing body, and I draw from Thomas Fuchs, who speaks about the lived body, where the lived body, they articulates the movements, the kinesthetic movements, but these movements have no meaning on their own. A circle is a circle, okay? A circle here, a circle with the hands. But then you have the corporeal body, and it's the corporeal body that puts meaning to the kinesthetic movement. So therefore, and some of you might recognize it, but this is just the quickest and easiest way. The circle here, the circling of the wrist and the circle of the arms become a gesture. The circle of the torso, this becomes the circling of the geret, when we dance geret. Or the circle here becomes the winding movement. And the winding movement within the Caribbean space and the African space represents the cycle of life. It represents a hooting at death, because for each one of us that death takes away, we have the life-giving source to put it back. Okay? So it's the speaking of the body. And then the second is the functioning of dance and the corporeal and corporeality amongst or between male and female dancehall participants. So within my chapter, I actually talk about the difference between the male dance, the female dance, and what each of the bodies signify when they're dancing on their own and how they operate. So it talks about the men then become the warriors, and the females, they become the empresses, they become the queens, but also importantly, they become the link, they become the mortar that connects everything. They become they represent the sense of survival. Because in the whining, whether it's whining normally, or whether it's on the head top when they go upside down and they're whining upside down and standing on their heads, the feet will kick. As the feet kicks, everybody moves back because nobody wants to be kicked in the face. But it creates space. But also, it represents the fact that they have the means and the will to survive. Because when nobody was able to protect them, because during enslavement, the men were also enslaved, and so they were not able to protect the women how they would want to. So the women had to protect themselves. And so therefore, the dance represents all of that. And finally, dance as a spiritual communication transcends it transcends and enables the individual to become samadhi, to become somebody of worth. Okay? So, can we move on then, please? So, when we look at dancehall has insecure connections because it connects the African and the Neo-African music and dance expression. So within my work, I tend to focus on the John Kuna masquerade, revivalism, and Kumina. But I do touch on the others. You have so many others like the Dinky Mini. Dinky Mini is done for the death observances, and it connects the material world and the spiritual world. And then you have the other form, but revivalism is important because with revivalism is the way in which we hid the African traditions within the Orthodox Christian religion. Okay? So, as I said before, we look at the male warrior perspective, we look at the female whining. And the male warrior, I didn't put the picture there because we've been seeing them up until this point. The female whining is where, the female whining is where the women actually are able to articulate themselves and take control of the space. Because at one point they were being marginalized and pushed to the side. So they have to fight and physically take control of the space for themselves. And then we have the coupling, which is the gender difference where male and female come together. So in relation to the book, Hall is a practitioner. He's a teacher, choreographer. He's known as the dancehall professor. But in his chapter, he outlines dancehall's migration and economic currency. Lantoinette Steins, she talks about, she's a choreographer and a Yoruba practitioner. So she's a priestess in her own right. She highlights the synabridging of the old and the new. So she talks about the way in which dancehall allows the synabridging, the interconnection of our African and Neo-African practices in a contemporary form. But she also highlights the fact that there are those who are now coming into the dancehall space and taking it over. And they are trying to push the warrior women who bubble and whine and what I call tumble. Because the tumbling is, when you look at the whining, it's a circling movement, but it's a forward and back movement. So when you put the two together, you get a tumbling action. Okay? Thank you. Lawrence, she talks about, she's a choreographer and a costume designer who I've worked with a lot in the past. And she talks about masquerade within the dancehall space as being the place where the dancer can connect with their inner space. So it becomes a platform from where the dancer begins to articulate themselves. And this foregrounds the corporeal body, which is where it intersects with my work also. Okay. Yeah. Patricia, that Pat mentioned earlier on. She's a dance practitioner. She's one of Jamaica's top dancers. She worked with the Dance Theatre of Harlem for many years. And so when she came back to Jamaica and she was part of the National Dance Theatre Company. But then also she always had a love for African dance and for the African and Neo-African practices. But she wanted to bring the formality that she had learned within the contemporary and classical dance style. She brought that into dance and she started to do that using the dancehall. And so she actually talks about dancehall as a space where the boundaries are being pushed. But she challenges the insecurity of the notion that dancehall it either reflects or it generates violence and slackness. So she warns about that and challenges this notion as something that we have to dig deeper into. Thomas Tallower-Presto, as a choreographer and performer himself, he looks at the gendered negotiation of the male whining. The male whining within the Jamaican context, within the dancehall context, is seen as transgressive. It's a no-no. Man not supposed to stand up and whine like how the women will whine. But man will whine when dancing with the woman, so that together the two bodies connect and they will create what Ralph Norman talked about as jouissance, when the two connect and come together. So that's where you get the male whining hip. But this is contradictory to what happens within the African and Neo-African practice, because within the mentor, man will whine as well. When they're gonna bets it down, you find it within other parts of the Caribbean, within the soca, you have the wine and wine then. Machel Montano being a very good example of that. Within Africa, you find it when they do the kwasa kwasa. So the notion of whining and the idea of not whining, the male body not whining and not drawing attention to itself, is something that's very peculiar to dancehall. Stanley-NIaah, the other editor of this book, she's a cultural studies scholar, and she examines the politics of noise and in/security around Jamaican music. Because within Jamaica, the Noise Abatement Act is one of the modes through which the authorities actually seek to control, lock down, and prevent dancehall from growing. She argues that by focusing on the Noise Abatement Act, it will always put dancehall in an insecure position in relation to the rest of society. But what will make it more secure is if that act was replaced with the Sound Regulation Act, which would recognize the political economy of Jamaican reggae dancehall culture. So, I think it's up to finish with her, give her the final word since she's not here. She says there is a disconnect in what we do for play, work, income, and therefore what is seen as viable for development. So what she's saying is that somehow we're going to have to look at all of this because dancehall provides all of these things for the practitioners. And the insecurity comes about from those outside of the form who view it very differently to those of us inside the form. Okay. Thank you very much.
Our commentator is Kate Dossett, who is professor of history at the University of Leeds, where she has taught since 2003. Her research and teaching focuses on race and gender in the 19th and 20th century United States. Her two main areas of research interest are Black cultural history and gender history. Her current project, Black Cultural Archives and the Making of Black Histories, examines how the collection of Black cultural archives by the British and US governments in the early 20th century shapes access to and knowledge production about Black history and heritage today. Other projects include Radical Black Theatre, funded by the British Academy, and Feminist Archives, Feminist Futures, which is concerned with gendered histories of archives and their relationship to history making and feminist activism in the 20th and 21st centuries. And she has just completed an ISRF fellowship about the Lord Chamberlain censorship archives and its relation to foregrounding inadvertently Black theater production in the earlier 20th century. Kate, it's a real pleasure.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be on the panel with two such distinguished scholars, practitioners. I've learned a huge amount from this ambitious and really rich collection of essays, and I think taken together and individually they offer very different ways to think about positionality, expertise, and the frameworks that we use to identify, to categorise, to archive, and to value and celebrate creative forms. I was really interested reading these essays of how the editors in particular talk about the politics of interpretation, who does it and what is at stake and who does it. Collectively and individually, the authors address head-on insecurities in the politics of interpretation. What is the relationship between access to knowledge of expertise in dancehall and the ability to document, interpret and speak about its history and its presence? And several of the essays in this collection explore the question of who consumes, who accesses and who profits from dancehall, and what is going on when outsiders engage with it. As a white woman trained in United States history and Black studies, both in Britain and in the US, I bring my particular set of outsiderness to my reading and interpretation of this essay collection. And I felt myself responding from the very outset to the editor's provocation or encouragement in their note on style. I love the front matter in books. I love reading acknowledgements. I love hearing about where this collection came from and what the ambitions for the book were. And in the note on style, which is quite early on in the front matter, I felt I needed to respond to the encouragement for readers to enjoy their own negotiations within /security. And I think I took that provocation up. I did enjoy my own negotiation within /security. I've long been interested in who gets to decide what is preserved, what's valued and labelled as an archive, and the power of archives to sustain particular ideas and groups or to make others invisible but I have very much still to learn about the history and practice of Jamaican dancehall, though I feel I've begun with this collection. Reading the collection, I was thinking a lot about the insecure role of the archive in performance studies broadly, and what performance studies scholars could learn from this book. And I think one lesson might be the insecurity of interpretation and the insecurity of would-be interpreters. In her essay, Lantoinette Steins suggests that insecurity in dancehall is perhaps most prevalent amongst non-practitioners. And she provides this really fascinating account and creates this really interesting scene of Black American choreographers being flown into movie sets to recreate dance movements, but not really thinking to consult local practitioners. She talks about, and this is a quote from Lantoinette Steens, she talks about the egos flying. She talks about how incomers are possibly unaware of their insecurities, that they do not know that Jamaica is the dancehall capital of the world. And I found that really fascinating. And it really reminded me of the work of the American performance studies scholar Diana Taylor. And Taylor, in her 2003 book called The Archive and the Repertoire, she suggests that performances don't necessarily give outsiders either access or insight into another culture. Rather, they reflect a desire for access, and they reflect the politics of interpretation and who gets to do that interpreting. And I think the idea of performance reflecting a desire for access is really interesting and really chimed with some of the themes of this collection. Reading this collection, what performance studies scholars describe as the desire for access might actually be better understood through the framework of in/securities, because I think this is a method which really upends, really disrupts outsider assumptions about who experiences and who acknowledges insecurities. The collection also got me thinking about what the scholar Daphne Brooks calls limited regimes of looking, and how Daphne Brooks is an African-American scholar, and she's thinking about how Black women performers in the US context, through enslavement and beyond, how they find ways to disable, to disrupt, to deflect these limited regimes of looking. And sometimes they do that by raising awareness that these regimes exist in the first place. And I think the idea of Lantoinette Steens' idea of how a lack of knowledge or a lack of curiosity or awareness of what it is we don't know is in itself a form of in/security. And I think that was a really exciting and provocative theme of this book. Another thread that I kept returning to throughout the collection was this relationship between the archive and the repertoire, and the ways in which the two are so frequently constructed as a binary, not in this book, but in quite a lot of performance studies scholarship. The US performance studies scholar Peggy Fellon suggests that the life of a performance is limited to the present. It cannot be saved or documented because in the process of being captured, it becomes something else. And I think this question about the staying power of performance, its ability to transmit, to communicate history, traditions, desires, past and future, is a profoundly political one. And I think it's one that's also informed by a very particular idea about archives and their relationship to embodied knowledge. In this Peggy Fellon vision, the archive is always stable, it's always fixed, while the repertoire is always dynamic and changing. But as many practitioners have pointed out, this is perhaps a false and problematic binary. Performance artists and archivists both have challenged us to consider performance and archives as radical, as mutable, and archiving is itself a form of creation, a form of production. The archival scholar Tara Hunt, for example, examines how, for performance artists, the body could be a means of recording, a way of transmitting knowledge, part of, rather than separate to, the archiving process. And so reading this volume, I was really fascinated to learn how performance and historical archives could interact. And in particular, I was interested in how the archives of Jamaican dancehall, who gets to identify what they are, who gets to care for them and curate them, how all of this shapes understandings of dancehall and the performance possibilities available to artists now. I was also really interested in how different generations of practitioners and teachers and international audiences or imagined communities interact with recorded performances. And I was especially interested in and would love to learn more about the ways in which the capturing and the documenting of Jamaican dancehall through video and especially through the smartphone, how has that changed both popular and scholarly understandings of it? And I think these were questions that some of the essays probed in various ways. Landry Steins considers generational differences, for example, in relationship to dancehall and technology, and what happens when cultural data is misrepresented. That's her phrase. And in fact, I think in Steins, but in some of the other essays too, age and generational differences or generational sharing was another really prominent theme. I think Patsy Rickett's essay as well was really interesting around generation. At one point describes dancehall as an adult space. And I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to hear more about that. So I wondered what were some of the challenges of documenting dancehall through the smartphone, or through writing for that matter. How does the writing or the recording of dancehall capture, or can it capture the spiritual aspects of dancehall? How can it attempt to capture the feel, the experience of music? And how does the ease of recording performances, how in what ways does it open up new opportunities and challenges when this archive is co-curated and disseminated by a very broad transnational community? H uses Benedict Anderson's term, imagined communities, perhaps slightly wryly, I felt, but H can speak to this. He uses this term, imagined communities, in regard to those who use, copy and make a secure living from watching recordings of dance practitioners, recordings which are broadcast across social media. And that made me wonder what this means if imagined communities become influential archivists of dancehall. And then this collection of essays itself feels in many ways like an archive. Practitioners, scholars, practitioner scholars and teachers documenting the history, the local and global contexts that have informed and continue to shape dancehall, acknowledging and spending time with those whose influence needs to be acknowledged or needs to be acknowledged in new ways. At the same time, the collection contends with the problematic binary between the archive and the repertoire. H explores dancehall as, quote, a repository of the cultural expressions that precede it, a form of embodied knowledge capable of transmitting alternative histories. And these alternative histories help secure its practitioners through dance and, as we've learned, through the corporal dancing body. And this got me thinking about how this collection transmits alternative histories that secure particular practitioners, and some of the decisions that went into the documenting and communicating of the experiences of practitioners. As Kate and Pat have already said this evening, some practitioners write themselves into the book, while others are represented through interviews which are transcribed by other contributors and editors of the book. So what are the opportunities and challenges? What is lost and what is gained in using the framework of this very handsome, hardback, but also very expensive Routledge book? What's lost and what's gained by the creative labour being held and contained in this particular text? And it seems to me that one of the promises of this collection is to create and even secure a particular archive, to document the creative labour of practitioners and scholars. Pat suggests that the line between security and insecurity is a porous one, constantly negotiated through lived experience. And I wondered about the experience of imagining and nurturing this wonderful collection into being as a print book, free to some, to the first 20 people, perhaps, that came tonight, but expensive to others. It has really coherent themes and very different writing styles. It has many shared experiences, but also many contradictory viewpoints. As a reader, you pick up this book, especially the hardback, and it feels solid and real and almost inevitable. But as editors, did you experience what Pat calls the delicious precariousness between success and failure? And once the collection is out in the world, what does success and failure look like?
I just want to connect with what Kate was saying about, because that was a really interesting commentary. And I guess that one of the things that H has just demonstrated really well is that the body is an archive. So that separation between, you were saying between, which I thought was really interesting, between archive and repertoire. It's a really interesting way of thinking about it. But the body as an archive means that I think that's really important for us as Black people. We carry our history in our body because everything else gets stripped away at a certain point, right? That's the thing, that fixed point of enslavement. Everything gets stripped away. So what you carry is that it is the body. And that body then is multiply expressive. It carries all kinds of things with it. So it's an archive that's often been silenced, and it's an archive that's often despised. But it's an archive that has a richness for that history. And as you say, it's both stable and dynamic, because you pass things down through the body, but the body also changes. And so it's really interesting to think about the body as an archive, because it's very plastic. It moves and it changes and changes, but it also has that genetic material that carries on down, and also that continuing tradition. So there's that bodily repertoire that we take from one to the next, and it's always it's a source of great pleasure to see your children dancing, because then you can see that they have that sense of who they are, and that you pass something down to them, and I think that's all really interesting. And it's made me think a lot about the organisation Decolonising the Archive, Connie Bell and Etienne Joseph, and the work they've been doing for so many years. They wrote a really great piece called Everything is Everything, which was in a collection that we have put together. But in there they talked about the importance of the body as an archive, and the way in which thinking about embodiment as an archive pushes the notion of the archive from this kind of static thing that we protect in rarefied atmospheres to something that actually is out there. So you don't need to disseminate it. We already have that. It's already out there. Everybody has a body, right? So we're all already equipped with archive. And it's incredibly kind of powerful challenge to Western notions of the archive. At the moment, I'm co-lead of a project, a Stuart Hall Archive project. As you know, the University of Birmingham has the Stuart Hall Archive, which is donated by Catherine Hall and her family. And it's kind of then we're starting to think about what do we do with that. Well, my part of the project is about what's the legacy of Stuart Hall now. So what are the ideas that Stuart Hall would have had and could have had? What are people doing with Stuart Hall's ideas now? So that kind of idea that the archive, yes, we have the archive, we want to digitise it, we want people to come visit and everything else, but the main thing for me is getting out there, getting a sense of what did he do in Birmingham, what did he do with lots of other people, and we're starting to uncover that sort of black side of Stuart Hall, because obviously his new left side is much more heavily publicised, but that kind of sense of him as part of the Black community is probably not so well known. We're starting to sort of think about that, but also to think about his ongoing legacy and importance, particularly in the Black community in Birmingham. What's the continuing legacy of that? And we're finding that there's a lot there. So those sorts of less tangible forms of archiving are really interesting to sort of pick up. You're never quite going to capture them. That's the thing. You're never quite going to possess. They're quite slippery. And that is a reason for their longevity. Because once they get brought in behind the wall, then actually they're becoming accessible to most people. So that keeping them that little bit intangible is what makes them fully accessible to a lot of people.